Myroslav Shkandrij is a prominent scholar on Ukrainian cultural history and Professor Emeritus at the University of Manitoba in Canada. He has written extensively on topics such as avant-garde art in Ukraine, Ukrainian nationalism, the representation of Jews in Ukrainian literature, cultural imperialism, and decolonization. His book, Russia and Ukraine, Literature and the Discourse of Empire, From Napoleonic to Postcolonial Times, published in 2001, remains a classic text on Russian cultural imperialism and Ukrainian resistance to it. I invited Myroslav to revisit this work and reflect on how literature has for centuries served as a battleground of ideas between Russia and Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher, the chief editor of UkraineWorld, and the president of PEN Ukraine. UkraineWorld is an English-language media outlet that explores Ukraine and its connections to the wider world. It is run by Internet Ukraine. This episode is produced in partnership with Kyiv Mohyla Academy and the Heritage Ukraine project, supported by European Union's Erasmus program. You can support our work on Patreon. Your help is crucial as we rely heavily on crowdfunding. You can also contribute to our volunteer missions to frontline areas in Ukraine, where we deliver aid to both soldiers and civilians. Donations are welcome via PayPal. You'll find all the links in the episode description. So let's begin. Myroslav Shkandrij, welcome to this podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad that we finally can talk and that you found an opportunity to talk to me. You are in Canada, I'm in Ukraine, but let's try to analyze some of the things that are present in your book, which is very important for me, which is called, in English, Russia and Ukraine, Literature and the Discourse of Empire, From Napoleonic to Postcolonial Times. So the Discourse of Empire is very important, as you know, for Ukrainians today. We're trying to explain also our history through this lens of imperialism and cultural imperialism. How can we approach the Russian literature and the Russian culture through this lens?
Well, I looked at classic writers in Russian literature, and then at how this discourse was challenged by Ukrainian writers. So one way of approaching it is by looking at the discourse of empire as constructed by in Russian culture in general, but in literature in particular, and a counter discourse, an opposition to that discourse in Ukrainian literature. And essentially, it boils down to a simple equation. The idea of one and indivisible Russia, a Russia that has existed for 1,000 years and which includes Ukraine, and a second oppositional discourse, which is the Ukrainian one, which argues for the existence of a Ukrainian people, a Ukrainian nation, and therefore it is a discourse that argues that history has been a struggle for national assertion, a national self-assertion, for national liberation. And those two concepts, one an indivisible Russia and a national liberation struggle, kind of encapsulate the two ways of writing history, the two ways of thinking about history in Russia and Ukraine. But I think what you're asking is probably about the kind of tropes that occur in Russian literature. And when I looked at the literature of the last 200 years, I was struck by the recurrence of certain tropes within Russian literature, constantly and over several generations. One of them is this idea that Ukraine is an anarchic borderland, a wild lands, which is very common in colonial discourse. Imperialists, colonizers, always think of the place they are colonizing as free, open, uncivilized, a place where they begin a new civilization. The second idea is this concept of a single Rus that has existed for 1,000 years. It is a concept that includes Muscovites, meaning Velikoruсы or Russians, Ukrainians, who were called Malorossi or Little Russians, and Belarusians. And this idea of a single Rus runs through all the literature. A third trope, which is recurrent, is this idea of vastness, power, and glory. You get it all the way through from Peter the Great, Peter the First's time, Derzhavin, and then in the 19th century, Khomyakov. This concept that Russia is so big, so powerful, it is irresistible. Another trope that is very common throughout this literature, Russian literature, is the idea of the requirement of absolutism. Because Russia is so big, so scattered, so vast, contains so many components, it has to be an absolutist power. It has to be an autocracy. And this is repeated in generation after generation, not only by writers, but by historians, by politicians, up to the present day. Another trope is the unique mission of Russia. This is the particularist argument. It is the third Rome. It is a new civilization. It is a non-Western civilization. Then there are many more. The sense that Russia had to expand organically. It never conquered anybody. It just was so attractive that it spread and people willingly joined it. This is also a trope that is repeated today. This concept of a legitimacy of assimilation and expansion. There are many more. One of the most common is this concept that was later, at first voiced early in the 19th century, but then supported by people like Dostoevsky, that Russian culture was universalist. It included all the best in Western culture. And as Dostoevsky said, Pushkin was unique and remarkable because he was able to speak with the voice of other cultures, other nations. In other words, you don't need to read anything else but Russian. Russian literature is enough for it. It includes all voices. It includes all people. This, of course, is nonsense, but it is part of the trope that one of the numerous tropes that were developed throughout the 19th century and afterwards to justify Russian expansionism and assimilation of others.
One of these tropes is, by the way, that you haven't mentioned yet, is assimilation. And it's very interesting how this idea of assimilation is very important for the Russian imperialism, and much more important than for many other imperialisms, let's say, because the maritime imperialisms work with the logic of difference, while the continental imperialism, as Russian one, works with the logic of sameness. Basically, they're saying to the colonized that you are the same as us, and just adopt our language, adopt our culture, and you will be the same as us. And it's, of course, very much one of the engines of today's war, because Russians are saying that Ukrainians are just Russians, spoiled Russians, and Belarusians are just Russians. Would you agree with that the logic of assimilation plays a big role?
Well, of course, it is one of the tropes. From the Russian point of view, why would you want to be anything but Russian? If they are so marvelous, if their culture is so attractive, if they are so powerful, one would expect them to think that assimilation was a good thing. But it was an ideological construct, and in different times, it was voiced differently. So there is this kind of seduction of non-Russians to leadership positions. They could become Russian if they wanted to have careers, to climb the social ladder, and it was expected that other nationalities, other nations should learn Russian and absorb the Russian culture. But the other side of the coin there was that if there was resistance, there was a very fierce response, brutal, genocidal, extermination of peoples, entire nations, deportations of entire peoples, entire nations, if there was resistance, or if they were considered in any way subversive. So there are two sides to that coin. But the official view was that the country was slowly assimilating all smaller nationalities, even though those so-called smaller nationalities were more than half of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. And this continued. The idea was under Stalin and under Brezhnev that you would get convergence leading to complete fusion. And in 1964, Brezhnev announced that the process of creating a single Soviet nation had been completed, that one people had been formed. And of course, that immediately led to resistance and complaints and to the dissident movement producing many texts arguing that this was not a willing acceptance of Russian hegemony, but it was a forced process. So this does make Russians' culture a little different, but if you look closely, it is based on an ideological construct that was always challenged.
An interesting role played in the 19th century, because it's an important part of your book, the 19th century, the Romantic era, both in Ukraine, in Russia, in Poland, and in many other European countries. An important role is played by Poland, because we know about the Polish uprisings. And, well, if Ukrainians were portrayed as Malorosy, the part of the Russian nation, then Poland was portrayed as something different, as a kind of the challenge to these Slavic nations, the too much Catholic, too much feudal, too much aristocratic. But then we have the texts, and you quote them a lot. Of course, the famous poem by Pushkin, To the Slanderers of Russia, but also you quote Tuchev, the poem on the storm of Russia, I guess, and also Boris Godunov by Pushkin. Tell me if you see the parallels in the way how Russian literature was portraying the Polish uprisings in the 19th century, and the way how Russian ideology and propaganda now portrays the Ukrainian fight for freedom.
Well, there definitely are parallels between Poland then and Ukraine today, mainly because the Russian Empire saw resistance from Poland. Poland was the superior culture. It was the longer culture. It was the more sophisticated, more European culture. And Poland still had many important individuals who were part of the right bank Ukraine, the western part of Ukraine, west of the Dnipro River. And the Russians knew that. And they could see the different culture. They could see they had a sense of inferiority even towards the Poles, who had been there a long time and who had always been the major challenger to Russia among the Slavs. But it was the 1830 uprising and the 1863 uprising of the Poles that really frightened the Russian Empire. And then they came down very strongly against not only the Poles, many of whom were exiled, but also they began to fear a similar process in the Ukrainian cultural revival would lead to Ukrainian political demands. So if you're looking at today, I think similarly, Russians today, or the Russian administration, the Russian leadership today, does see Ukraine as very different. It fears that difference. One of the reasons for the invasion, both in 2014 and 2022, was this idea that Ukraine presented Russians themselves with an admirable alternative, with a way of life, with a democratic country, a thriving culture that was tempting to Russians themselves. And so Russians would ask the question, why do we not have something similar? Why are we so impoverished culturally, politically? And I think that was one of the driving forces behind the invasion. So yes, Ukraine does figure as the other, the alternative, the different path that can be taken. Something like Poland did in the early 19th century for Russian imperialists.
There are also opponents of this Russian imperialism inside the Russian culture, but I wonder, it's very interesting to know your opinion how important and influential they are. So you quote some of them, for example, Ryleyev and his poem Voinarovsky, which took a different stance towards the question of Mazepa, the famous question of Mazepa rebellion against Peter I. To our listeners, just to explain to you that we have an episode about Mazepa. You can listen to it, but to cut the long story short, it's a big question of the Ukrainian rebellion against Peter I, Russia in early 18th century. And then, of course, in the Russian canon and primarily in Pushkin, again, we see a very negative image of Mazepa. But we see much more positive ones in people like Ryleyev or maybe somebody else. But it all seems to be too marginal for me personally, this anti-imperial trend in the Russian culture. What do you think?
Well, I would agree. At the time of the Decembrist uprising, there were people who opposed autocracy, and they looked towards the Ukrainian history, the history of a rebellious Ukrainian Cossack leadership, for some examples, some inspiring examples for their own politics. But they were crushed very quickly, and it became clear that Mazepa had to be portrayed in Russian culture as the arch traitor, which he was. He was burned in effigy, or hung in effigy, and then annually he was denounced by the Russian Orthodox Church. An anathema was read on an annual basis. So this became symbolic of how any Ukrainian resistance has to be treated. And Russians saw this. Russians were educated on this. They understood where how they had to behave and how their loyalties had to be expressed. And they did so. So throughout the 19th century, there were very few people who spoke out in any way positively about Ukraine's autonomy or independence. The two people that are always mentioned are Alexander Herzen, Bakunin, and essentially that's it. Whether Russians were liberals or conservatives or radicals. They did not support Ukrainian autonomy or independence. In fact, they found it ridiculous for the most part. Until you get to the 20th century and the revolution, the fall of Tsarism, then there's some movement there, but not much. And you get exactly the same situation today. There are people like Boris Akunin, Vladimir Sorokin, Lyudmila Petrashevskaya, who speak out clearly in favor of Ukraine's right to exist, and who denounce the Russian leadership. But for the most part, even today, Russian dissidents are very careful. They will speak out against the treatment of their own dissidents, and they will complain about Putin's autocratic rule, but they will never go as far as saying that Ukraine has been invaded wrongly. Those territories were taken from Ukraine by force. This was against the international rules. They should be given back. They simply avoid the question of Ukraine whenever possible.
Let us talk a little bit about Ukrainian resistance, intellectual resistance. And you talk in this book about a lot of people, actually, both in the 19th and 20th century. So I would ask you to lead us a little bit through these names and through their importance, because I assume that for many of our listeners, they will probably hear these names for the first time. In the 19th centuries, of course, people like Taras Shevchenko and people like Panteleimon Kulish and Mikhailo Drahomanov and Boris Hrinchenko and Ivan Franko. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit how their responses were different maybe from each other, because we know about the different philosophies of Taras Shevchenko and Panteleimon Kulish, for example. Shevchenko more egalitarian, Kulish probably more elitarian, elitist, at least more middle class probably. Or we can say that Drahomanov, who is the greatest intellectual figure, one of the greatest of intellectual figures of the 19th century, was opposing the romantic historiography of the and philosophy of the early 19th century. And of course, the role of Franko, who is basically the reforming very much the Western Ukrainian discourse, the Galician discourse, and a little bit teaching Galicia to be Ukrainian and not Russophile, for example. Can you tell me a little bit more about these figures?
Well, there's a lot of history there, and one could look at each of these figures in turn. But I think the sweep of history here is the growth of a national movement and of a national liberation, an argument for national liberation. Anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism is present in all those figures, but each one of them expressed their politics and their position differently, because circumstances were different. There was less opportunity in different times. So for Shevchenko and his generation, they were Democrats. They were revolutionary Democrats, perhaps, or national Democrats, and they would they had a program in which Ukraine would be part of a European group of states, an equal partner with other European and other Slavic nations. When you get towards the latter part of the century, the strategies change. Drahomanov was a very progressive person, but also a person who wanted to see slow progress through education. And many of the discussions within the Ukrainian camp was, do we build up slowly? Do we support the prosvitas, and do we turn to cultural work, translation work. That was the strategy employed in the 1880s. But they criticized the Russian imperialism, and they criticized the autocracy, and they look forward to a time when the Ukrainian people would have full Ukrainian literacy, which they expected, quite rightly, would lead to political demands. And then when you get to the very end of the century, around about 1900, you get the first political parties formed, not just in Galicia, but also in central Ukraine, in Kharkiv, Poltava, which clearly called for an independence for Ukraine. So the stages were there. All these people went through different parts of this evolution, and each put forward a different strategy. My feeling is that these are all part of an attempt to decolonize, an attempt to speak clearly about the evils of Russian imperialism, and to galvanize the Ukrainian people, to educate the Ukrainian people, to support their own movement, but with a strategy that it's sometimes an unspoken strategy, that it would lead to political change. And that is in fact what happened. The underground streams of the Ukrainian movement were not visible, but they were gathering force, and they burst out. They came out from underground in 1917. Russians were shocked when hundreds of thousands of people supported the national movement, when demonstrations in Kiev, Lviv, and around Ukraine brought out thousands and thousands of supporters of autonomy, and then later of independence.
I would move now to the 20th century, and again, there are many names, but I would pick up three. Lesia Ukrainka, obviously she's partly in the 19th century, Mykola Khviliovy, and Yevhen Malanyuk. And obviously we can also talk about Vasil Stus, and you're talking about Vasil Stus. Yes, I would include Stus as well. You also talk about Domontovich. He's also very interesting, very intellectual. But let me focus on these three names, because I think they're very important. Lesia Ukrainka, I think she did the greatest job to show that Ukrainian culture is not provincial. And I think, and it's obviously something started with Drahomanov and maybe with Franco, but she just put this feeling to the greatest level, and therefore she was taking always the big topics of the world literature, the ancient Greek topics, the medieval topics, the early modern topics, the actually modern topics, etc. Many of them were actually coming from the foreign literatures, and I think she has shown how you can actually write a Ukrainian literature on the global topics on an incredibly high level. Khviliovy, because he was showing that communism is possible while it is not Russian, and socialism. Let's put it this way: socialism and communism can be also Ukrainian, and they're probably more Ukrainian than Russian, because Ukrainians have this feeling of egalitarianism and the horizontal relations, while Russia is all about autocracy and what Khviliovy will call mishanstvo, meaning this, very mediocre feeling. And Malanyuk, because he was a right-wing, very harsh right-wing writer. So it's interesting how to compare Malanyuk and Khviliovy. Khviliovy very leftist, Malanyuk very right-wing. But Malanyuk is somebody who tried to teach Ukrainians not to be soft. and therefore all these ideas of strong man and the man of steel, and all these ideas that we need to come back to the Viking legacy, we need to come back to the Roman legacy. What would you say on this interpretation of mine?
Yeah, I mean, you got it right. I would add a few things, though. Your interpretation of Lesia Ukrainka is interesting. For me, I would add that she came out of a feminist modernist movement, very European, very internationalist, in fact. And, for her, gender equality and national equality went hand in hand. Why shouldn't they? Why should not women's liberation be part of national liberation? Of course it should. And so she brought a very special tone, a special sensitivity to all her works. And this is one reason why she is now being rediscovered, and why much of her work resonates. I would also say that Khvelyovy, for very similar reasons, in fact, is still relevant. Khvelyovy came out of first the Social Democratic and then the National Bolshevik movement. And the strategy there, or the ideology there, was to say that, yes, we are communists, we are Bolsheviks, but we're also Ukrainian. And you will not have an international revolution, you will not have socialism, if you do not recognize the national movement and the legitimate rights of Ukrainians to have a state. So he supported, as did all the National Bolsheviks in the 1920s, he supported a Soviet Ukrainian state. It would be Soviet, but it would also be Ukrainian. And the concession that the Russian Bolsheviks had to make was to give Ukraine a cultural Ukrainianization, which took off from 1923 to 1932, roughly. It was the official policy of the Soviet Union. In fact, all the histories that were written, the books that were written, the polemics that took place, the party announcements, all stated that the main difficulty, the main problem for the revolution in Ukraine was Russian chauvinism. Russian imperial mentality and Russian chauvinism were the enemy. They had to be overcome. And the best way of doing that was to support a Ukrainian educational process to make Ukraine Ukrainian. Now it's sometimes forgotten, that was official policy until 1932. And in 1932, after Stalin had taken over and began arresting the entire Ukrainian intelligentsia, and then manufacturing the collectivization and the famine, the policy was changed. In 1932, it was declared that the main enemy was not Russian chauvinism, but Ukrainian nationalism. That was a signal that things had changed. But Khvelyovy was very clear. He used this sort of historical argument that if a nation throughout its history shows that it wants to be free, that it wants independence, then to challenge that, to stop that, to block that, is to go against progress, to go against natural development. And this was his final statement in his last pamphlet, Ukraine or Little Russia, which was banned and which was only found after Ukraine's independence in 1991. But the gamble, or the dream of the National Bolsheviks collapsed with Stalin's arrests of almost the entire intelligentsia. That means writers, politicians, all the prominent cultural figures. Out of about 380 writers, I think there were only about 30 left by the end of the 1930s. And the third figure you mentioned, Yevhen Melanyuk, is fascinating because he came out of the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917 to 1920. And the great trauma for that generation who fought for an independent Ukrainian state, the great trauma was why they lost. They asked the question, why did we lose? We were so close, something went wrong. And people reacted differently. They came to different conclusions as to why the struggle for independence failed. One of these was the idea that Ukrainians had been too soft, as you say. They had not been, they had not devoted their time to building up an army early enough and fast enough. They had believed the claims of Russian socialists and Russian communists that you didn't need national independence. The collapse of Tsarism and the development of a Bolshevik regime would solve all problems. So that generation throughout the 20s created a new ideology. That ideology was we need to rely on our own forces. We need to build up our military strength, our military capabilities, and we need to have a mentality that is resistant to Russian pressure and to Russian propaganda. And for those reasons, it sounds today attractive to quite a few people. It's the beginning of a kind of a national assertiveness, which is anti-Russian at the core.
Indeed, and I think the role of these people today is very very important. Actually, of course, there is always this danger of going too much to the right wing and to the far right, but at the same time, we wouldn't have the mood in Ukraine today, this mood of extreme resilience and extreme capability of resistance, if Ukrainians didn't hear this message of people like Melanyuk. Probably doesn't mean that the soldiers are reading Melanyuk or somebody like that, but the message came through for some reason, and it is present in the Ukrainian society. You cannot be too soft when you're close to such an enemy as Russia.
Well, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, this strength of opposition is not only this Melanyuk-like defiance, is not just a phenomenon of the post-1917 revolution. It was a phenomenon that captured Ukrainian social democrats, socialist revolutionaries. All of these people fought very bravely from 1918 to 1920 for an independent Ukrainian state. And what the present generation fails to realize is that they produced excellent studies of why the revolution of 1917 to 1920 failed. They reached similar conclusions, but it wasn't just a psychological problem. They argued that the Ukrainian revolution failed because of the imbalanced social structure. The cities were not Ukrainian. The cities were generally dominated by Russians, by Poles, by Jews, depending on whether you're talking about central or western Ukraine. Ukrainians did not have control of the various mechanisms that you need to have if you want to set up an administration and a state. And so people like Pavlo Hristyuk, who wrote a splendid account of the revolution, which is now being translated into English, by the way. People like Isaac Mazepa, who wrote another account. He was a social democrat who wrote another account of why that revolution failed. Or people like Mikita Shapoval. These are classic works that describe the problem. And unfortunately, the next generation tended to blame that generation for being psychologically unclear, being not being forceful enough. I think if you read those works, you'll find that's not the case. So it's not quite as simple as the nationalist generation made out.
Let me probably go to the last part of our conversation and come back a little bit to this question of empire and imperialism, because I'm interested how you place yourself and your approach in this amalgam of theories of imperialism. Everybody, of course, knows about Edward Said and his framework of cultural imperialism and the Orientalism. There is also an important concept of Occidentalism, with which people tend to look on the way how Russian Empire looked at the West, looked at Europe, and also presented in a very ugly terms. There is the framework of semi-Orientalism, which is present in the work of Larry Wolff, whom I interviewed also for this podcast. Is your approach different? Tell me.
Yeah, well, I have been reading a lot about decolonization. And so my approach would be very close to, first of all, to the kind of cultural decolonization that took place after the 1950s. And the classics, there would be Edward Said and his Frantz Fanon, and their kind of dismantling not only of the literature of empire, but also the psychology that goes with it. However, I've been very impressed by recent studies in the decolonization debate, and particularly by the impact that young Ukrainian scholars are making in this debate. They are not only looking at the issues of from an economic, political standpoint, but they're looking at them from the standpoint of this psychological, cultural sort of malaise that has been created after so many years of Russian hegemony. So they are arguing that Ukrainians have to break mentally, emancipate themselves mentally from the Russian way of thinking. Khvolyevy said the same thing during the literary discussion of the 1920s. But the younger generation of scholars who are now, Ukrainian scholars who are now looking at decolonization, are analyzing this in every aspect, in art, in literature, in film. They are making a major contribution. And they're coming up against opposition. There are people in the so-called global South who feel that that Ukrainians do not have a right to speak about decolonization because they were never colonized in the same way as Africa, Asia, or some other countries. There is opposition to the concept, but I think that the way Ukrainian scholarship is approaching this is the correct way, and it is making strong inroads into this debate around decolonization. I think that over the next while, as many of these works get published, translated into English, and disseminated, I think that the young Ukrainian scholarship is going to have a tremendous impact on the entire global decolonization debate, because the mechanisms that have been employed in postcolonialism and in decolonization, the kind of methodologies that are used, the approaches that are used, are very relevant to Ukraine. And Ukraine has a lot to offer. It has, as we have spoken, it has many, many generations of struggle against an imperial power that has been brutal. And it offers many examples that could be extremely valuable for other countries, for other struggles. So my approach is now very much linked to decolonization, if that's the question that you were asking.
Thank you, Myroslav. Thank you for this conversation, and I really advise our audience to read Myroslav Shkandrij's book. We primarily talked about the book, which is called Russia and Ukraine: Literature and the Discourse of Empire, from Napoleonic to Postcolonial Times. You will find the link in the description of this episode, but there are lots of other very good works by Myroslav, available in English, of course, that I really advise to read. Thank you very much, Myroslav Shkandrij, for participating in this conversation.
Thanks, it's been a pleasure.
This was a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld, an English language media outlet that explores Ukraine and its connections to the wider world. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher, the chief editor of UkraineWorld, and the president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today was Myroslav Shkandrij, a prominent scholar of Ukrainian cultural history and Professor Emeritus at the University of Manitoba in Canada. You can support our work at Patreon. Your support is crucial as we rely heavily on crowdfunding. You can also contribute to our volunteer missions to the frontline areas in Ukraine, where we deliver aid to both soldiers and civilians. Donations are welcome via PayPal. You'll find all the links in the episode description. I can also remind you that this episode is produced in partnership with Kyiv Mohyla Academy and the Heritage Ukraine project, supported by the European Union's Erasmus program. Thank you for listening. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.